My name is Melora, and I'm one of the tutors here at International House, and I've also been working as an intern with the Citizen Diplomacy Program as well as the English Tutoring Program. So I'm really excited to talk today with you guys and kind of hear a little bit about your experiences too with using a learner's first language in the ESL context. So let's just go around and do names, and I also want to know what languages you speak and where you learned them, how you learned them, just a brief description of those languages. So I'm Melora again. I speak English as a native language, and Spanish I learned in school, starting in 9th grade all the way through my junior year of college. And then I actually learned to speak Spanish in an immersion setting in Argentina my senior year of college. So that's my language exposure. I also know a little bit of Thai and Burmese, or I did at one point, but those phrases are long gone. So, start with Wally.
Oh, my name is Wally, and I speak Danish and a little bit of Swedish.
Okay. How did you learn Danish and Swedish?
Well, I lived in Denmark 17 years.
Would you say those are native languages for you?
No.
No?
Sounds good. My name is Megan. English is my native language, and then Spanish is my second language, or additional language. I started learning in 2nd grade, and basically just kept learning in a school setting throughout college. It was my major, and so pretty much what I've learned has been in the classroom and through interacting with clients here at International House.
My name is Carolyn, and my native language is English. I took French in high school and Spanish in high school, and I can go to a resort and, ask for something in Spanish, like where's the bathroom, or, little tiny things. But other than that, no other languages.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Nandini, and I'm native language is English, and I'm learning Spanish in the university right now as a second language.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. We'll jump back to your language learning experiences in a little bit. But I wanted to start off by talking about some general theories of language acquisition. I'm sure you guys are familiar with these in one way or another, but these are kind of general theories of how humans learn languages in general, whether it be a first language or a native language or languages later. So we have the behaviorist model, which says that children are just imitating what they've heard from caregivers and from others. So they hear sounds, they realize how those sounds are responded to, how others respond to those sounds, and they imitate those sounds in order to get a similar response. Or they make noises and kind of test each one, see how their caregiver responds to the noise that they make. If it's a positive response or it's what the child wants, they continue making that sound. So that's the behaviorist model of thinking about how we acquire language. The innatist model is that this is the language acquisition device idea from Noam Chomsky. It's that humans are distinct from all other species because they have this universal language acquisition device somewhere in their heads. It's spoken of as a black box. We don't know how it works, but humans have it, and this is how we acquire language. All children have this. So it's a biologically determined mechanism, and that's how we acquire language. So this is a contested idea and also a very influential idea about language acquisition. And then we have the interactionist model, which says that social interactions between children and caregivers are how we acquire language. So it's an exchange, right? Caregivers will model language, children will produce language, and then based on those responses, again, this is similar to the behaviorist model, language develops over time. So these are kind of just general frameworks for talking about how we acquire language. And then if you look at your handout, it's a little bit easier to read. This is the top model on the front side of this. It talks about how these three perspectives kind of play out. The role of the child in language, for example. In the behaviorist perspective, the role of the child is secondary. The child is just imitating and responding to shaping the environment. Versus the innatist perspective would say that the child is primary in language acquisition because the child has this LAD, this language acquisition device in their head that allows them to pull in language and then produce it. However that works, we don't know neurologically in this model, but that's the primary role of the child. Or the interactionist perspective would say that the dialogue between children and others has the primary role. So it's neither the child or the environment, but both are involved. Both are crucial. So as we're looking at second language acquisition, these different perspectives can be very important. Does anyone have comments on this particular chart, on the information here? It's really interesting, I think. This is one of the most fascinating things that I talked about in linguistics in college, which is these three models and contesting them and how research kind of bears some out and doesn't support others, and how we develop these theories over time. Yeah, any comments, Megan?
It almost makes me wonder if part of it is a little bit of all of these different ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there is a black box in our brain that deals with how we learn language, but then we also are seeing how people interact. And if I'm a little kid and I want my juice box and I make the sounds juice box and Wally gives me a juice box, then I learn that. But it's just so cool how it's the ultimate same goal, but different theories are proposed how we actually get there.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot. Any other comments? So I pulled this chart from one of the textbooks that Megan has on hand. It's the Reading, Writing, and Learning in ESL book, so if you guys are interested in reading some more from this book on the topic, you can definitely talk to Megan about checking it out. And then the second chart talks about the implications of these theories for instruction, for second language instruction in schools. So we can talk about a behaviorist model that involves a lot of learning by rote, very structured learning, repetitions, drill responses where you do a worksheet that asks you to conjugate a verb in the third person singular 20 times. And it drills it into you, and afterwards you can repeat this knowledge. So that's kind of a behaviorist approach to the ESL classroom, or to any language learning classroom. Or a natist model would say that structure is a lot less important. So people are kind of soaking up everything that they're exposed to. There's a silent period expected when people are learning a language. I know this bears out in my personal experience learning Spanish. I had studied it for 7 years, and then suddenly went to Argentina, could speak not a word of Spanish, was quiet for a couple of months there before I suddenly started producing a lot of language. So it rings true for me, the natist model a little bit there, but I think, like Megan was saying, there's a little bit of truth in all of these, and maybe over-reliance on one could be dangerous, or could just fail to be as effective as we might want. So, as we're looking at these three models and the implications for second language acquisition, I wanted to see if anyone has examples of extreme application of one of the three. So, for example, a language learning classroom where you were not allowed to speak native languages at all and were punished for it. Or an immersion experience that kind of drew on the natist and interactionist models and kind of let you learn language at your own pace without too much grammatical instruction. Any personal experiences in the classroom or outside of it?
I know I had a study abroad experience in Peru, and I think it's more of the interactionist. But I remember, I would sit down and have try and have conversations with my host mom, and she would also correct me. So we weren't doing drills, but if I was saying something with a masculine article and it was a feminine word, she would correct me. So that was really helpful. But at the same time, I know in theory, I've learned it through the drill method, and it was still different when I was speaking the language to reproduce them.
Karen, it makes me think a little bit about your time on the Hopi reservation, a little bit with how you were exposed to the Hopi language. I don't know if you wanted to share anything about that.
Well, it's not a written language, and so you can't really study it. You have to hear something, and someone interpret that for you, and remember it, and then you can use it. So I could only say a few things, a few phrases that I could remember. But in that language, I found that even one day it was American Indian Day, and the chief was there, and he was telling these stories in Hopi, And I was with the kids because I was a teacher there. And I said, "What's he saying?" And they'd say, "I don't know." You know, whenever our parents don't want us to know what they're saying, they speak Hopi. So, you know, I feel I was, I thought, gee, this is a language that can just go away.
And almost with that, it's sort of it's a little bit where the kids are learning, but they're almost learning to not learn that language because they figured out, oh, so if the parents don't want us to find out, they're going to talk in this language, so there's no need for us to engage. It's kind of almost a different way of looking at kind of how they're interacting and learning that way. I know when I was in college, I was an assistant teacher for a Spanish class for very basic Spanish. And the way that we were required to practice with the students is we had to snap, and we'd do verb conjugations. Like if we were learning how to say ear, to go, you'd have to snap at people. What's yo? What's tu? What's el? And just how nervous people got, it made me feel so terrible because this is the required method with all the snapping and pointing. But I felt like my group of like 5 or 6 students would finish up and really not have learned anything because they were so nervous about when I was going to come at them and snap. And in retrospect, I almost wish I'd just kind of done my own thing as opposed to kind of doing what I was told, because by the end of the semester, I honestly don't know if they learned anything from my just snapping at them and making them conjugate, and just talking and working that way could have even helped out a little more.
What do you think was the thinking behind that approach?
Yeah, that would probably be a little more of a behaviorist method. Probably what they were thinking is that since I wasn't the primary instructor, I could really reinforce some of the verbs and maybe those structural things that a teacher in class wouldn't have time to go over with like 35 kids or students. I guess they weren't kids at that point. But at the same time, just how nervous the group would get almost started to cancel out their ability to learn. Because if you're nervous about when you're going to get asked something, you're not really going to absorb anything else. You're so on the offensive. Yeah.
Carolyn, in your situation with Hopi, would you have wished for more like grammatical instruction by rote or that sort of thing? Would that have helped you?
You know, maybe, but there was such a large percentage of the time that English was used, and then there were other, like the Hopi reservations surrounded by Navajo. So if you listen to the radio, they spoke Navajo on the radio, and so there was just all of these languages being spoken, and so it just seemed a little overwhelming. But everyone could speak English. The kids, the adults, so we kind of went with that.
There's lots of reasons to rely on that.
Right.
Yeah. Lingua franca. Great. Let's see what's next. So beyond these theories, there are some more factors that affect second language learning, as we all know. Formal and academic study versus a more immersion-based approach. Age is certainly a factor, especially if you're past the prime window, which some people say is before age 7 or before age 12, depending on what theories you're looking at and what research you're looking at. But past that age, it can be a lot more difficult. And language is actually has been shown by some studies to be stored in different parts of the brain based on what age you're learning it. So that can certainly be a factor. And then literacy in other languages. I have some experience with ESL instruction in Washington, D.C. with immigrants and refugees, many of whom didn't have much literacy or academic experience past grade 1, grade 2 in their native countries. And so there was kind of this tension between, do we start with literacy in the native language, or the second language was Spanish, the native language was a native language in Guatemala, for example. Do we try literacy in Spanish, or do we jump to literacy in English? What should be the focus? And I think there's not a solid answer to that we came to. Do you guys have experience with students in that situation, or a similar situation? I think it could be tricky.
Because I guess in the situation you're in, where you're in DC, were these adults or children?
These were adults.
Adults, and so they may be wanting to learn English while they're here. to be able to communicate, to find work. But at the same time, it's so hard to learn to read and write in another language if you've never learned to read and write first. So that is that tension. It might even, this sounds terrible, but depend on the amount of time you have with the person. If you're going to get to work with them for 5-7 years, which some studies say is about how long it can take to really become fluent and able to use a language, working intensely on it, you might start first with Spanish and then slowly draw English in. If you're only meeting with them for 30 minutes once a week for a month, you might even dive in and try and just get what you can, basic phrases in English.
Right. And in some situations, there's also the pressure of assessment and how is the program assessed, how are the students assessed. If it's a job skills and English assessment, then you might want to start with English for some of the time. But what's best for language acquisition is maybe a different question. So literacy in other languages, and then also socio-cultural, personality, and cultural factors. This, for example, could be extroversion versus introversion, how often women versus men are encouraged or allowed to speak in public situations, and that sort of thing. And then the expectations of the instructor, the person that the student, the learner is working with. How are the lessons set up? How is the learner trying to please the tutor on a certain topic, but maybe not asking questions about the thing that they're more interested in, out of respect, or out of just following what the teacher or the instructor wants to do or has planned, that sort of thing. Kind of that interaction can affect second language learning. And then the goals of the learner. Are they trying to learn to be able to get along, to have a conversation with a native speaker and feel successful afterward and be understood and have understood? Or is it more an academic proficiency sort of goal? Are they looking to start at CPCC in a couple of years? So these things can affect how learning is going, how well it's learned, and what to focus on with the student. Any comments about this sort of thing?
I feel like age sometimes even scares people off from learning. I know, for example, my mom would love to learn Spanish, and she's 55. She's not here, so she won't mind my sharing. But what she says is, I'm too old to learn. And my belief is that you're never too old to learn a language. Like you said, it may get stored in a different part of the brain. It may take a little more time. But I think that's something that scares so many people off. And it's the idea of only when you're a child can you really learn another language. It can really be an obstacle for many people, even getting started.
Yeah, a perceived obstacle, for sure. Yeah. Okay. So, with all of this in mind, these language learning theories for first languages and second languages, there's some research into the best ways of applying L1, the native language, the learner's first language, in the classroom or in a setting where the learner is learning a second or third or fourth language. And some of these are using the first language to improve performance on meaning-focused input and output tasks, which basically means vocabulary, right? Equivalency in the L1. So if there's difficulty in understanding the meaning of a word in the target language, English in this case, well, what's the word's equivalent in your native language or another language that you speak? It's very easy, very simple, very efficient. So there's that. And then using translations to convey meaning of vocabulary and idioms. So language-focused learning. This is similar to the vocabulary in that it's an expression in one language that you're trying to explain using expressions in the first language or second language. So those are pretty similar to each other. And then using the first language to supplement fluency development tasks. So these are tasks where the learner is asked to produce language in the target language. That's pretty challenging, pretty difficult. This is producing language orally or in writing or whatever it may be. Using L1, so then the native language to support the learner in doing that. So it's a challenging task. It may be daunting. It may be embarrassing to the person to produce this language and know that they're going to be making pronunciation errors or other kinds of errors. But using the first language to build them up towards that task, particularly more challenging tasks. So that's kind of broadly what the research seems to show are the best applications for the first language in English and second language learning. And then, as Carolyn mentioned earlier, there are a lot of reasons to rely on the first language. when you're trying to learn another language. And we're all familiar with these because we've all learned other languages. It's comfortable. You feel confident, you feel proficient in your first language. So why would you use another language, especially when there are people who understand you in a different language, when there's a lingua franca, when the radio is in this language and everyone understands English anyway, right, in that context. There's also kind of a perceived efficiency thing, I think. This is true for me. I want to be understood and I want to understand quickly, and it's slower in a language that I'm less proficient in. So I'm going to jump to my native language if I'm going to be understood in it. So there's that. It's also personal identity, and this is true when you're speaking to strangers, and I think when you're speaking to people that you know well, also people you have relationships with. Some people may have stories or examples of trying to practice a second language with someone you share a native language with. Does anyone have experience with that? In my experience, you just fall back to your native language much too easily. It's constant. It's a battle to keep it up in that other language. That's because you're comfortable in that first language, and you guys have a relationship built on certain terms or forms of address or whatever it is in your first language. And it's hard to change that. And then competence, which of course is related to competency and proficiency in that first language. Does this ring true to anybody? Anything to add to this list?
Nothing to add, but my experience when I went to Finland was suddenly there was no English available. There was a little bit of Swedish, but mostly Finnish. And not knowing Finnish very well at all really brought home another situation which happened last week when I was at the Spanish conversation class. And I was just listening, and I understood an awful lot more Spanish than I did Finnish when I first came to Finland. But it's interesting how being in a culture or a society where you can't rely on language one makes a huge difference in learning.
Absolutely. Anything to add to this list?
It does really reinforce that sometimes, like Wally was saying, you can understand so much more of a language than you're comfortable producing. For example, if I sit in on a Japanese conversation hour, I understand very, 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 very little. But even that little amount that I actually understand, I could produce maybe 0.00001 of that tiny amount I understand, and part of that, it really does come down to confidence as well. And if I really think I know how to say, "Hi, my name is Megan" in Japanese, I have a better chance of actually being able to pull on that knowledge and produce and practice.
Absolutely. So lots of reasons to rely on the first language or another language that you're comfortable in, even in the context where you're trying to learn a different language. But here are some approaches from a couple of the resources in the ETP library for reducing that over-reliance in an ESL classroom or in a tutoring context or just in your language learning with other languages in general. Of course, choosing manageable tasks that are well modeled and within the learner's proficiency. So this goes back to comfort and helping the learner feel a little bit more comfortable and a little bit more confident by having the task modeled for them and having it seem within their reach. And then preparing learners for tasks by pre-teaching language items and skills. So this is kind of the scaffolding idea of building vocabulary, building phrases, building the grammatical knowledge, and then putting that all together before asking someone to produce language. And we're all familiar with this, I think. Using staged and graded tasks, so providing some sort of feedback along the way as the learner is asked to produce something or as they respond to a question, providing feedback, grading, so that they're able to build their confidence when they produce language correctly or when they do something correctly. And then employing repetition, of course. We all know that this is helpful. Although it may be a little bit silly to do a worksheet and conjugate the same verb 20 times, it's effective, I think, in some ways. Maybe remember it a little bit better. And then this is especially true in kind of an ESL classroom where a number of students speak the same native language and are pretty tempted to use that native language even when they're not supposed to. So making the target language an unavoidable part of the task. So this can involve like asking one student to retell a story in the second language. It can involve completion activities or role playing. So making it impossible to like complete a worksheet by talking through the answers in your native language, for example. And then discussing the goals of the task with the learner in the first place. So kind of having an open dialogue about reasons why we should focus on the target language, at least while in this setting. And kind of developing buy-in with the learner about that. And being very explicit and open about that. And even to the point of discussing the reasons for reliance on the native language in the classroom, and suggesting solutions and helping learners to talk through the ways they want to encourage themselves to use that target language more than the native language in the classroom. In a classroom setting, more than a tutoring setting, heterogeneous grouping by native language is helpful. So not putting all the Spanish speakers in one group and all the Vietnamese speakers in another group, or allowing them to self-group in that way for group activities, but breaking them up so that they're forced to use the common language, especially if that common language is the target language. And then set up a monitoring system to remind learners to use the L2, especially using some of the suggestions developed in open dialogue and sharing with students. Can be really helpful for buy-in. And then going back to confidence and comfort, using non-threatening tasks that allow learners to develop confidence through practice, especially before they're put on the spot. And this can differ based on the personality of your student, but even in the tutoring context, I think it can be helpful when you're in a fairly quiet room and there may be 3 or 4 people hearing the learner produce language in English, reducing the embarrassment that may come with that. Or even the slight hesitance to speak loudly or to speak at length in English. Being aware of that potential for embarrassment can be really, really helpful for the student. And then finally, scaffolding, building ladders from the first language to the target language. So if you have a strong relationship with your student, recognizing when they tend to jump back to the native language, or to jump away from the native language production. What makes them nervous? What makes them retreat? And then focus on those edge of the comfort zone areas, focusing on tasks that build their strengths right at the point where they want to stop, right at the point where they want to fall back on what's comfortable, building confidence at that point. And with repetition and modeling through the I do, we do, you do progression of tasks. So I do it to show you, we do it together, and I ask you to do it by yourself. And then, of course, teaching classroom and transition language on an ongoing basis rather than just focusing on the content of a lesson, but the conversation when you come into the classroom. What is the language about? The bus was late, or I missed the bus, that sort of thing. What's the language around? Do you have a pencil? These things that may not come as part of an explicit lesson, but the learner may need or want to feel more comfortable and to use the language in kind of an organic way. So these are just general approaches and strategies. I wanted to ask if any of those approaches were used when you guys were learning a second language or a third language. Are there any experiences that you had in the classroom that made you feel more comfortable learning a language or less comfortable learning a language? What were the outcomes from the strategies that you remember being used in those classrooms?
I would say one thing, especially in middle school, high school Spanish, when you're kind of forced to maybe take it, not everybody in there wants it. If you're taking maybe a Spanish course somewhere else, like as you're older, you're probably in there because you probably want to learn it. But even talking about the goals that the learners have to learn that particular language could be helpful. For example, if you asked like my 8th grade Spanish class that I was in, so why do you want to learn Spanish? Probably the answer was we don't. We have to so we can go to high school. And I really do feel like discussing, okay, so you want to learn English, you want to learn Korean, Japanese, why? And just sort of reminding the learner of those goals can be really helpful. For example, if you do want to learn Spanish so that you can get a job in Costa Rica where you're moving, sort of having that almost as a little way to keep you motivated and moving forward. Or if you want to learn English so that you can converse with your grandchildren who only speak English and you don't. Just sort of having that almost as the incentive to keep going even when it's difficult.
And that can be very informative too for the tutor or the instructor to say, well, what kinds of things do you talk about with your grandchildren? Would you like to talk about with your grandchildren? And building that vocabulary and helping the learner feel a lot more confident to start a conversation. Absolutely. Does anyone with your tutor that you're working with right now, do you use the learner's native language? Do you know the learner's native language at all?
I don't know Russian, but I did bring a Berlitz, how to have conversations in Russian, and I used that one time to so that she could see what, you know, the English and the Russian equivalent.
Okay.
So that seemed to work out pretty well.
How did she respond to that?
Well, she I think found that, you know, to be much easier. So even though I couldn't pronounce the phrase, she could at least read it.
Okay. So she's literate in Russian.
Yes.
And even then, too, you're taking a risk and saying, I don't know how to pronounce this, but look, your language is valuable and I'm going to try. That can even be a relationship builder, too. Wow, my tutor is willing to maybe mispronounce some things, too. That makes it a little less scary for me to do that. And to realize you went to the effort to find a Russian dictionary that can help explain. I think that's a huge builder, too.
I have an experience of giving the language proficiency exam to a potential tutoring student here at International House in the room next to us. And when we were going through the tasks of the exam, the student seemed a little bit distracted, like she was listening to something. And it turned out that in the classroom next door, there was a Spanish language class. And my student was a native Spanish speaker with low proficiency in English. And she came over to me and she said, they teach Spanish classes? And you could, I think it was something about the value of the language, right? Yeah, people are very interested in learning your language too. It is valuable in itself, and I think that was a big relationship builder with that particular student.
Because I know Johnny May talked a little bit about this in her presentation, but a lot of times when people come to the United States and they do want to learn English, either at some point they internalize that they have to leave behind their previous language, their previous identity, or people either consciously or unconsciously communicate that to them, that their language isn't valuable, that instead of trying to add on another tool, it's trying to replace this tool that they've used maybe their whole lives. And I could definitely see that moment of, wow, there's people who want to learn my language too.
Yeah. Especially with the history of immersion-only classrooms in English language instruction in the US, where students are encouraged to not speak their native language at all for the purposes of learning English faster or better, and based on ideas that people can only really learn one language at a time, which isn't true, but which affected, I think, a lot of parents' willingness to speak the native language to their kids. They hold their kids back by speaking, for example, Vietnamese to their students, their kids, at home, and try to speak English instead. So I think it can be powerful to counteract that narrative. Yeah. How are we on time?
We are at 12:40.
Well, that's all I've got.
Yes. That sounds good. And I'll let you hit pause on our video.